So, today I want to talk about really old Bible translations, specifically really old English Bible translations, because the history of the first Bible translations into English is a really fascinating story. But first, I kind of want to review why there were no English Bible translations in the Middle Ages. So, in the Middle Ages, there was this idea going around that, the Bible is complicated, and if regular people read the Bible, they're just going to get confused and they end up having all kinds of weird ideas. So, it's better to just let the really educated people read the Bible, like priests and professors and those kinds of people, and they can explain it to everybody else so that people don't get confused. And the way they made sure that only the educated people could read the Bible is that they only kept it in Latin. Now, the Bible was originally written in Greek and Hebrew and Aramaic. A Latin translation was done very, very early because that was the original, the ancient language of the Roman Empire. But by the Middle Ages, the only people who can really read Latin are the really educated people. The regular people are reading, German and French and English and Dutch and all sorts of other languages. But only the really educated people are reading Latin. So if you keep the Bible in Latin, that makes sure that the regular people can't read it. Now, just to play devil's advocate for a minute, that part of this makes sense, right? Because the Bible is complicated, and there are people who will read it and they will misinterpret it, and they'll come up with all kinds of wild ideas. So, uh, the problem is that the solution to this is not to read the Bible less; it's to read the Bible more. It's to get people to understand the whole Bible, so they don't just take two or three verses out of context and go off on some sort of weird tangent you know so but that was the idea, and so Bible translation in the Middle Ages is illegal. You can't translate it in any language other than Latin. It's only to be in Latin. The first person to try to translate the Bible into English is John Wycliffe, and he's working in the 1300s. And if you've ever heard of Wycliffe Bible Translators, Wycliffe Bible Translators is, of course, named after John Wycliffe. They're a missionary organization. They go all over the world translating Bibles. And Wycliffe wants to translate the Bible into English. And he knows it's against the rules. He knows it's illegal. He knows he's going to get in trouble, but he decides he's going to do it anyway. And the thing about Wycliffe is not only is he a brilliant scholar, he is also a very shrewd political operator. Because, see, in the political arena in England during the Middle Ages, there was always these conflicts between the king and parliament and the church over who exactly was in charge of what. So, like, the king makes rules and enforces rules, but if those rules are about religion, does that mean the church needs to be involved? And then the church gets tax money, but do they collect it on their own, or does the government collect it and they give it to them? And then Parliament's involved somehow because they have power now, but nobody's really sure what those powers are. So basically, every time something politically important happened, it always turned into this like three-way tug of war between the king and the church and the parliament over who exactly had the authority to deal with it. And Wycliffe knows this, and so Wycliffe, even though they all agree that Wycliffe is breaking the rules and something needs to be done about that, Wycliffe manages to play them off against each other and keep them arguing for long enough for him and his assistants to finish the Bible translation. For what it's worth, they finally did agree to condemn Wycliffe and to sentence him to death. But by that point, he had been dead for 31 years already. So they dug up his corpse and ceremonially executed it, because that's how they rolled in the Middle Ages. They executed people who were already dead just to make a point. Now let's fast forward about 150 years. It's now the early 1500s, and we're in the middle of the Reformation. And the Reformation is about a lot of things, but one of the things the Reformation was about was that the reformers believed that everyone should be allowed to read the Bible. You shouldn't just have to take the priest's word for it. You should be allowed to double check what the priests are telling you. So the reformers go around and they're translating the Bible in all sorts of language. Martin Luther gets the ball rolling by translating into German, but there were other people working on translating it into French, translating it into Dutch, translating into all sorts of languages. And then William Tyndale comes along, and William Tyndale decides that he's going to translate the Bible into English. Now, you might be wondering, well, wait a minute. Wycliffe already translated the Bible into English. Why doesn't Tyndale just use Wycliffe's Bible? Why does he need to do his own translation? Well, there's two reasons why he didn't just use Wycliffe's Bible. The first reason is that, the English government had spent the last 100+ years trying to track down and burn every copy of Wycliffe's Bible that they could find. So it's not exactly something that's easy to come by this point in history. By the way, there are still some Wycliffe Bibles around. In 2016, one of them sold at auction for $1.6 million. So just in case you happen to have a 600-year-old copy of the Bible lying around, that's probably worth some money. But anyway, that's the first reason, is it's not that easy to find a Wycliffe Bible by Tyndale's time. The second reason that Tyndale wants to do his own translation of the Bible is that, with all due respect to John Wycliffe and the tremendous work he did for doing the first English Bible translation, the translation he did was not considered to be very good. And the reason it's not considered to be very good is because John Wycliffe did not speak Hebrew and he did not speak Greek, which means he could not actually translate the Bible into English from its original languages. All he did was translate his Latin Bible into English. And if you know anything about translation, you know that that's a big no-no. You don't do a translation of a translation. You always go back to the originals. And the reason for that is because there's no such thing as a perfect translation. Every translation, even the best translations, are going to have imperfections in them. So when you start to do a translation of a translation of a translation of a translation of a translation, that's going to lead to all kinds of problems, because the errors are going to build up over time. And so you always want to go back to the original languages. But Wycliffe couldn't do that because he didn't speak the original languages. And so he did the best he could. He translated it out of the only language that he had the Bible in. He had the Bible in Latin. He translated it in English. So again, huge step forward. At least it was in English. Even a not great translation is still better than nothing. But not up to Tyndale standards. Tyndale decides he's going to do his own. And Tyndale does speak Greek and Hebrew and Aramaic and like 7 other languages, because William Tyndale was a bona fide genius. But he knows that if he translates it in England, he's going to get in trouble like Wycliffe did. And he's not under the impression that he's going to be able to put this off until 31 years after he dies, like Wycliffe did. So he leaves the country and he goes and finds a place that's more Protestant friendly, where he can do his translation. And he ends up landing in Germany and in the Netherlands, and he travels around quite a bit. But in 1525, he finishes his New Testament, and he, again, translated directly from the original Greek. He finishes his New Testament, and he finds a publisher in Antwerp, in what is now Belgium, to publish his New Testament. Now, this New Testament, as soon as it gets published, Tyndale immediately has a price placed on his head. So he's in trouble now. He's a fugitive now. He hasn't done his Old Testament yet. He starts traveling around. He's now on the run. He's moving from house to house looking for anybody who will take him in. In hindsight, he probably should have waited until he had the whole Bible ready and the whole Bible done before he published it. But, you know, I get it. He finished his New Testament. He was excited. He went to the press and got the translation published. But it made it very difficult for him to try to finish his Old Testament now that he's essentially a criminal on the run. We don't actually know how much of the Old Testament Tyndale ultimately ended up finishing. Most historians or scholars estimate he probably finished about half of his Old Testament translation. We know he did at least the Pentateuch, so that's Genesis through Deuteronomy. We know he did at least the book of Jonah and a couple of the Psalms, but we don't know how much else he did. But then he is betrayed by a friend who was supposed to be sheltering him, or what he thought was a friend who was supposed to be sheltering him. He is captured and he is burnt at the stake for the terrible crime of translating Bibles. And his incomplete Old Testament translation falls into the hands of his assistant and his student, Miles Coverdale. And remember that name because it's going to be important in just a minute. Ironically enough, right about the time that Tyndale was captured and executed in the Netherlands, the King of England had a change of heart. He decides to switch teams, and now he is a Protestant. So instead of being opposed to Bible translations into English, he is now in favor of them. And so he calls his top religious advisor, the Archbishop Thomas Cranmer, and he tells him, I want you to assemble all of the best and brightest minds in all the land, and I want you to bring them all together, and we're going to put together a translation of the Bible in English. And I always kind of picture like Tyndale like looking down from heaven and just being like, really? You need a committee now? I was almost done. You could have just waited a few more years. But he gets this committee together. Cranmer gets his committee together. It's full of a whole bunch of really smart bishops, but what ends up happening is exactly what usually happens when you get a whole bunch of highly educated intellectuals in one room. They spent 3 years arguing about a whole bunch of random nonsense and didn't end up translating anything. So the king is getting frustrated and impatient, and Cranmer is getting frustrated and impatient. And so what ends up happening is Cranmer reaches out to Miles Coverdale. See, I told you he was going to be important later. And what he tells Coverdale is, look, the king's breathing down my neck. He wants a Bible in English. These bishops aren't getting anywhere. And I know you know about Bible translation because you worked with Tyndale. So do you think you can get me a Bible in English? And what Cranmer may or may not have known is that Coverdale was actually already working on putting the finishing touches on Tyndale's Old Testament. But the problem is Coverdale has the same problem that Wycliffe had, which is that Coverdale doesn't understand Greek or Hebrew. So the Tyndale New Testament is translated from the original Greek, and the parts of the Old Testament that Tyndale translated before he was executed are from the original Hebrew and the original Aramaic. But the parts where Coverdale is filling in the gaps of Tyndale's incomplete translation, he's trying his best to translate it from either the Latin Bible and from Martin Luther's German translation. So he's got the Latin and the German translations, and he's trying to use that to kind of fill in for the parts that Tyndale didn't finish. So unfortunately, we still don't end up at this point with a Bible translation that is completely from the original languages. But Coverdale finishes his translation and he gives it to Cranmer, and Cranmer takes it to the king, and the king puts his stamp of approval on it, and we have the first official legal Bible translation in English, and they call it the Great Bible, which is just a really cool name for a Bible translation, I think. And the Great Bible is historically significant for two reasons. The first reason is, as I just said, it's the first official legal Bible translation in English. Up till now, all the Bible translations in English had been illegal, and you weren't supposed to have them. This one is not only legal, it's endorsed by and supported by the king and the government. So that's the first reason it's important. The second reason it's important is that when the Great Bible is published, the king makes a law that every single church in the country has to have a copy of the Great Bible, and they have to make it available to anyone who wants to read it. Now, that may not seem like that big a deal to us modern American Christians who all have like 5 or 6 copies of the Bible just, sitting around gathering dust on our shelves. But you got to remember, at the time, they didn't have access to Bibles. If you wanted to read a copy of the Bible in English at the time, you just had to, you may have to journey miles to the nearest monastery or the nearest university, hope you could find someone who had a copy of Wycliffe's Bible or Tyndale's New Testament, and then hope that they would let you borrow it. But now there's a Bible in every church, and there's a church in every town. So all you got to do is go down to the local church and ask to read the Bible, and the law says they have to let you. So this is a huge step forward, but unfortunately that law ended up only lasting 3 years because there were enough old school priests who didn't like letting people read the Bible. And so the king changed the law, and it became at the priest's discretion for who was allowed to read the Bible. Unfortunately, by this point, most of the priests they'd gotten with the program. They kind of saw how things were going, and they were fine letting people read their copy of the Great Bible. But, if you were living in a town that had one of those old school priests, you may have to go to the next town over to read the Bible. But again, still, the Great Bible is just this huge step forward in terms of the availability of the Bible in English. That it's the first Bible that's, just around in every part of England. Okay, so we're going to fast forward again about 14 years, and in 1553, Queen Mary becomes Queen of England, and Queen Mary is a Catholic. Now, she is not going to start trying to take away the English Bibles. She knows that ship has sailed. She can't put the genie back in the bottle. The Bible is in English now, and she accepts that. However, she is going to try to move the country back towards Roman Catholicism because that's her religion, and that's where she wants the country to go. And so she starts persecuting these Protestant church leaders, and in some cases even killing these Protestant church leaders. So a lot of these leaders have to flee the country, and they settle in various places. Some of them settle in the Netherlands, some of them in Frankfurt in Germany. But one group of these English refugees fleeing persecution end up in the city of Geneva. Now, if you know anything about your Reformation history, you know the city of Geneva is where the great theologian John Calvin was living and working and writing and preaching. And since these refugees, the reason they came to Geneva is because they were Calvinists. I mean, they probably wouldn't have called themselves Calvinists at the time. I mean, if they had, Calvin probably would have slapped them because Calvin didn't like the term. But they are what we would now call Calvinists. And so they end up in Geneva, and Calvin and his followers had a lot of pull with the Geneva City Council. So when these refugees show up, the city of Geneva welcomes them with open arms. So now they're safe. They've settled in Geneva. And now that they're safe, they have to kind of wrestle with this question because a lot of these guys are pastors and they're thinking, well, how do we continue to serve our congregations and minister to our congregations when we can't actually be there physically in person? And especially because they don't know how long this is going to last. They don't know if this is going to be months. They don't know if this is going to be years. This could be forever. They may never be allowed to go back. They don't know. And this is kind of like the same question a lot of pastors are dealing with right now with the COVID-19 and all the quarantines and stuff like that is how do you minister to a congregation when you can't actually be with them? And these people back then, they don't even have Zoom to help them out. So they're kind of trying to figure this out. And what they finally settle on is they're going to undertake this project. They are going to create a brand new Bible for their congregations. And it ends up being called the Geneva Bible because it was printed in Geneva. And their plan was that they were going to create this Bible and they were going to smuggle it back into England and back into Scotland for their congregations. And the Geneva Bible ends up being special for 3 reasons. The first reason is that this is the first translation of the Bible into English that is completely 100% from the original languages. So hallelujah, we finally got that done. Every word of the Geneva Bible is translated from Greek and Hebrew and Aramaic, the original languages. There's no Latin, there's no German. It's all translated from the original languages. So that's great. The second reason the Geneva Bible is special is because the Geneva Bible is the first study Bible in English. It's the first Bible that has notes in it. Because again, remember, these are pastors. And so as they're writing this, and they're writing this for their congregation, because that's what their plan is they're going to send this to their congregations, they include these notes of, explaining different verses and interpreting different prophecies and trying to make sure that there are certain points that don't get missed. And so they just include these just copious amounts of notes in the margins of the Geneva Bible. And if you have a study Bible today, again, like that traces back to the Geneva Bible. This is the first Bible that did that with all of these notes. And those notes were very helpful to a lot of people, but they would turn out to be very controversial, as we're going to kind of see later on in this video. And the third reason that the Geneva Bible was so special is because in the 20 or so years between when the Great Bible came out and when the Geneva Bible came out, there had been tremendous advancement in the field of printing press technology. So back in 1539, when the Great Bible was being printed, the government just had to spend a ton of money to print up one Bible for every church in England. It was a huge investment in terms of funds. And the Great Bibles that were created were huge. That's actually why they were called the Great Bible. They don't mean like great as in it's a really good Bible. They meant great as in these things were huge. If you've ever seen one in a museum, these were like 4 feet across. And so when you open them, they're like huge. But by 1560, when they're finishing up the Geneva translation or the Geneva Bible, they can not only print it up incredibly cheaply, they can also print it up a lot smaller. And so the Geneva Bibles that get printed are closer to the size of our modern Bibles. And they print up hundreds of them. So this is the first Bible that is really mass produced for public consumption. The Great Bible was just, one for every church because that's how expensive they were. That's all they could afford to make. But the Geneva Bible, they can just churn them out. They can print them up and everybody can afford one. So that's the other reason why the Geneva Bible is special. And then anyway, as Providence would have it, right around the time that they're finishing their Geneva Bible, Queen Mary dies, is replaced by Queen Elizabeth. So she's a Protestant and all of them are allowed to come back to England. And so they come back to England, but they come back not empty-handed. They come back with hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of copies of this new Geneva Bible. And when they get back, these things go like hotcakes. Everybody wants a Geneva Bible because, again, think about it. If you've never owned a Bible before, I mean, if you always had to walk down to the church anytime you wanted to read a Bible and maybe wait in line if somebody else wants to read it too, being able to have your own Bible in your own house is a huge deal. And the Geneva Bible is the first Bible that allowed them to do that because they printed them up and they were cheap. And they're cheap and they have the notes in there to help you understand them, and they're small enough that you can actually carry it around. I mean, it was a really good translation. There's nothing not to like here. Actually, there was one thing that's not to like, which is that the notes were a little bit controversial. And this is where we get into that controversy because, see, the people writing these notes were Calvinists. That's why they were in Geneva in the first place. And at the time, the Anglican Church was the majority were Catholics, or sorry, the majority were Calvinists, but it certainly was not unanimous. And there were definitely people in the church who disagreed with some of these notes and how they were explaining certain passages. And so a group of bishops get together and they say, we need to make a Bible that doesn't have all of this Calvinist propaganda in it. We need to make a Bible that doesn't have these notes. And so they decided they're going to create their own translation. And the resulting translation is called the Bishop's Bible because it was made by a group of bishops. And the Bishop's Bible wasn't good. It wasn't. Most historians agree that it was not a good translation. The main reasons it wasn't a good translation is first because it used a whole bunch of big words that nobody knew. So again, the Geneva Bible was done mainly by pastors. This is done mainly by academics and highly educated professors and things like that. So they're using a bunch of words that the normal people don't understand. The second reason is it was very choppy. It really didn't flow very well. And they made the rather silly decision that they were going to try to keep the words in their original order as much as possible, which meant that there was a lot of like backwards sounding sentences where some of the verses sound like they were, like Master Yoda or something. Like, because they're trying to keep the words in the same order when that doesn't make any sense when you're translating it into English. So nobody really liked the Bishop's Bible. Nobody really bought it. Nobody really wanted it. They tried to revise it a few times, mainly by just copying and pasting sections from the Geneva Bible and from the Great Bible. Nowadays, we would call that plagiarism, but back then everybody seemed to be cool with it. But they copied and pasted parts from other Bibles into this in hopes that would make it more popular and better, and it really just didn't work. Basically, most people were still using the Geneva Bible, and the few people who were really, really opposed to the Geneva Bible's notes kind of just stuck with the Great Bible. The Bishop's Bible didn't really go anywhere. So that's how the Geneva Bible becomes the main Bible of the second half of the 1500s. It's the main Bible because it's really the only good translation on the market at that point. And that remains true until 1603. In 1603, a new king comes to the throne, and his name is King James. And he hates the Geneva Bible. Absolutely hates it. And the reason he hates it is the same reason that the bishops hate it, kind of. He doesn't have a problem with the translation. The bishops never had a problem with the translation either. Like, everybody agreed the Geneva translation, like the Bible text, is fine. It's a really good translation. But he had a problem with the notes. And unlike the bishops, though, his problem with the notes isn't so much theological. I don't think King James could have cared less about the difference between Calvinists and Arminians and Lutherans. He's a politician. That's over his head. He's more concerned with the political side of things. Because you got to remember, when the Geneva Bible was being written, it was being written by exiles who were being persecuted by kings and queens. And so one of the issues that was foremost in their minds and that appears and is featured prominently in their notes is this question of, when do you have to obey the king and when do you not have to obey the king? And so if you look at their notes on Romans 13 and on Acts 4 and on Exodus 2, you're going to find this where they're talking about, when do you actually have to obey the king and when is it okay to not obey the king? Because again, they were being persecuted and they were writing to people who were being persecuted, and that was a big deal. Well, James is an absolutist. James believes that the king is appointed directly by God and that you are not allowed to question him. He has absolute power. The answer to the question, when do you have to obey the king, is always, all the time, every time, no exceptions. And James doesn't like that his people are reading this Bible that says otherwise. So in 1604, he calls a conference to discuss a lot of religious issues, and they discuss a lot of stuff. But one of the things they discuss is King James wants a new Bible. And so he commissions the Bible that would end up being known as the King James Bible. Now, you might think, based on how I've kind of described this, that I don't like the King James Bible. But that could be further from the truth. The King James Bible is a fantastic translation. It's a top-notch work. It was incredibly accurate. It flowed very well. And unlike the Bishop's Bible, it was written in a way that was simple enough for regular people to understand. It was a really good translation. I don't know if it was better than the Geneva Bible. Scholars can debate that. But it was a really good translation. And so even though King James's motivations for creating the King James Bible were purely selfish and just based on preserving and protecting his own power, as it says in Genesis 50, what you intended for evil, God used for good. And he used James's not so good motivations to create a really good Bible translation. And so immediately after the King James Bible comes out, there's kind of like this competition between the King James Bible and the Geneva Bible. Some people are using King James, some people are still using Geneva. And, King James tries to put his thumb on the scales and make sure people are reading the King James Bible. And the way he does that is he issues a law that it is now illegal to print any other type of Bible besides the King James Bible. So I'm not going to take away your Geneva Bibles. You can keep reading them, but you're not allowed to print anymore. Any new Bibles that are printed have to be King James. Everybody basically just ignores this law. Everybody keeps printing Geneva Bibles. It's not, it doesn't go away. The only difference is now that anytime they print a Geneva Bible, they just put the wrong date on it. And so all of the Geneva Bibles that were being printed at this point all have the date 1599 on it. And so that way, if anybody ever stops you with a brand new looking Geneva Bible, you can say, no, this was printed in 1599. I just keep it in really good condition. And so that was how they kind of got around that law. They kept printing Geneva Bibles. And at this point, the split between who was using a King James Bible and who was using a Geneva Bible was largely a political split. The more establishment, pro-king, Anglican people were using the King James Bible, and the more anti-establishment, pro-parliament, Puritan groups were using the Geneva Bible. And that persisted for several decades. But then, towards the end of the 1600s, the King James Bible does eventually gradually win out and become the dominant translation rather than the Geneva Bible. But, there were always holdouts. Like as late as the American Revolution, you still had these hardcore Presbyterians who were still insisting on using their Geneva Bibles rather than the King James. But the King James Bible was the normal Bible, the main Bible for most of the 1700s. And then you get into the 1800s. And the 1800s were a time when religion just went crazy. And I could make a whole nother video about the 1800s and how all the weird stuff that happened in the 1800s. But basically, there were a million different splinter groups splitting off of, and every single one of those splinter groups wanted to make their own Bible translation. A few of them were good, but most of them were absolutely terrible. Things got a little better in the 1900s, but that basically leads up to the modern day where there's hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of Bible translations, most of which are probably fine, but some of them are still bad. But when you look back on it, I always think that story of the first Bible translations from Wycliffe to the Great Bible and Tyndale to the Geneva Bible to the Bishop's Bible, the King James Bible, is a fascinating story. And so that is what I wanted to talk about today.